Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the past, into the very streets of 18th century Paris. Picture yourself there, surrounded by cobblestone roads and towering stone buildings. The air smells a little of baked bread, a little of the river, and of something less pleasant, a mix of horse-drawn carts, city waste, and unwashed humanity. Now, imagine that, despite the lively bustle, the one thing you can't count on is water. Sure, you could see the Seine cutting through the heart of the city, but clean, drinkable water? That was a luxury only the wealthiest could afford. Paris wasn't the sparkling, sophisticated city we know today. It was a bustling, thirsty mess, and somehow, it managed to keep running. You probably won't survive this without appreciating modern plumbing. Back then, if you wanted water, you had to rely on fountains, public ones, mind you, spread out across the city. And if you were hoping for a little extra to bathe or wash clothes, you'd be out of luck unless you lived near one of the better supplied areas. This was a huge problem, and solving it was a matter of life and death for the people who lived there. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and post your location and local time in the comments. Let's see how far this historical journey is traveling tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, Paris was rapidly growing, its population swelling with each passing year. The city was already the cultural heart of Europe, a center for artists, thinkers, and traders, but it was also struggling with a fundamental issue: water. Paris's water supply was a problem long before the city became the bustling metropolis we think of today. The Seine River, which runs through the heart of the city, was a handy resource, but it also posed a huge challenge. Its waters were dirty, frequently polluted, and totally unreliable when it came to meeting the demands of a population that was growing at a rapid pace. So, the question became, how could Paris provide its people with clean water, and more importantly, how could it keep the fountains, those beautiful symbols of elegance and refinement, flowing without flooding the entire city? And that's where the real fun begins. Now that you've got a sense of the city's basic water woes, let's dive into why those public fountains were such a big deal in 18th century Paris. At the time, Paris was a growing, congested urban center. And just like today, water was essential. But imagine the sheer chaos that would have unfolded if each citizen had to haul their own water every day. Fortunately, the fountains were built not just as decorations, but as a lifeline for the public. These fountains weren't just a luxury. They were a necessity. Without them, Parisians would have struggled even more to stay hydrated and clean. Think about it. You're living in a city with narrow, winding streets, surrounded by thousands of other people. Your personal access to water is limited to what you can fetch, and there are no home plumbing systems like the ones we take for granted. Public fountains, especially in bustling areas like the Place de la Concorde, became critical touchpoints for daily life. But here's the kicker: fountains were also a symbol. A symbol of the power of the monarchy, the growth of the city, and the sophistication of Paris itself. The fountains weren't just built to serve a practical purpose, they were a statement. They reflected the city's wealth, and more specifically, they reflected the grandeur of the Bourbon monarchy, which was increasingly eager to prove that it could provide for the people, no matter how complicated the logistics were. They were meant to be a display of control and opulence. The fountains were artistic expressions, two well-designed structures meant to be admired and celebrated. Historians still argue whether fountains became more important as symbols of civic pride or as public utilities. Some say it was the water that made the fountains essential, while others insist that it was the social gathering spots that drew people in. Either way, fountains were much more than just functional. They represented an ideal of what Paris could be: civilized, clean, and elegant. But, while the fountains were symbols of luxury and necessity, their upkeep and constant flow were far from simple. The fountains needed to stay flowing in a city that had an unpredictable supply of water. The engineers tasked with this problem had to figure out how to create a system that could both provide enough water and prevent disastrous flooding. This wasn't just about plumbing, it was about controlling nature itself. As we move forward, it's impossible to talk about the fountains without mentioning Paris's most famous water source, the river Seine. The river itself was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it was a natural resource that ran right through the heart of the city, providing the lifeblood of water. On the other hand, it was unpredictable, often polluted, and extremely difficult to manage. In fact, the Seine had a long history of being far from clean. In the early days of Paris, it was used for everything: drinking, washing, even sewage disposal. And while the river was undeniably convenient, it certainly wasn't ideal. To make matters worse, the flow of the Seine wasn't always steady. Periods of heavy rain could flood the banks, while dry spells would lead to lower water levels. This variability made it difficult for the city's engineers to ensure a steady water supply, particularly for the fountains, which had to be continuously replenished. The real problem wasn't just the water itself, but what was in it. Paris was growing rapidly, and as the city became more industrialized, the Seine was burdened with even more waste. By the late 17th century, the water was undrinkable, contaminated by waste, chemicals, and other pollutants. Yet, despite this, the Seine remained the city's primary water source. To address these issues, the engineers of the day began to devise clever ways of diverting the water from the river. They didn't just want any water, they wanted to make sure that the water flowing into the fountains was clean enough to use. So, they began the process of filtering and diverting the water to specific locations throughout the city. But they didn't just rely on the Seine, they also began tapping into springs and other natural sources. These sources, though far more reliable, required the construction of complex aqueduct systems. But here's where it gets interesting: while engineers could divert water to fountains, the river's natural course still posed problems. The challenge wasn't just drawing water from the Seine, it was making sure that the water didn't flood the streets, that it didn't overflow from the fountains, and that it didn't run dry when people needed it the most. Historians still debate how much of the success of these early waterworks can be attributed to the river itself versus the engineering ingenuity that managed to control its flow. What made the Seine's management so tricky wasn't just the water's quality, it was its behavior. Flooding was a real issue, as was the low water levels in drier seasons. So how did Parisian engineers make the fountains work consistently, without flooding entire neighborhoods or running out of water during a drought? The answer lies in the carefully calculated and increasingly sophisticated engineering systems that were developed over the course of the century. As the water crisis deepened, the engineers of Paris looked to the past for inspiration. They didn't just reinvent the wheel, no, they drew upon the genius of ancient civilizations, particularly the Romans. Rome, the city of aqueducts, had already solved the problem of supplying vast urban centers with water. If ancient Rome could do it, why couldn't Paris? The key was in aqueducts, massive, gravity-powered channels that carried water from distant springs into cities. The Romans were experts in this field, having developed systems that spanned hundreds of miles, bringing fresh water from mountains to their urban centers. The water was typically sourced from natural springs and transported via aqueducts that used gravity to maintain a steady flow. These aqueducts were works of art, engineering marvels designed to withstand the test of time, and most importantly, to control the flow of water into Rome's fountains and baths. By the late 1600s, the engineers in Paris were looking at these ancient methods, wondering if they could adapt them to their own needs. But, of course, Paris wasn't Rome. For one, the city's landscape was much more challenging. The engineers couldn't rely on long, flat distances to bring water from distant sources like the Romans had. The geography of Paris, with its winding streets and the curve of the Seine, made it much harder to channel water efficiently. Historians still argue over how much influence the Romans really had on the 18th century engineers of Paris. Some argue that Parisian engineers were inspired purely by Roman texts and theoretical knowledge, while others suggest they were taking a more practical, hands-on approach. Either way, one thing was clear: the solution was going to involve some seriously innovative thinking. The first step was bringing in water from the suburbs, where springs flowed more freely and with better quality. The sources were relatively close by, but still required a complex network of pipes and channels to get the water into the heart of the city. The engineers had to navigate not only the landscape but also the city's complex urban layout. Paris wasn't built on a grid, and the steep hills added another layer of difficulty. To overcome these obstacles, the engineers began designing a series of aqueducts, many of which were buried underground, to keep the water from evaporating in the sun. These systems were designed to ensure a continuous flow of water into the fountains, without wasting any along the way. But as anyone who's ever tried to fix a leaky pipe knows, this wasn't going to be easy. The real brilliance came when they realized they needed more than just gravity. What they needed was a way to measure and control the water flow. In short, they had to bring a bit of the Roman genius into their work, but adapt it to the unique circumstances of 18th century Paris. As Paris grew, so did its need for water, and that need quickly outpaced the city's initial capabilities. The demand for clean water was relentless. The population surged, and with it, the number of thirsty Parisians, all competing for a sip from the fountains. More people meant more waste, more consumption, and ultimately, a greater strain on the already fragile water system. This demand was felt most intensely in the crowded inner districts, where living conditions were less than ideal. Many of these areas, particularly the ones closer to the center of Paris, had very limited access to clean water. The fountains, which had been a luxury only a few decades earlier, were now the primary source of drinking water for most citizens. Yet, there was a problem. The fountains were designed to serve only a small, localized population. As the city expanded, the number of fountains and wells had to be increased to meet the growing demand. But even with these additions, there was simply not enough water to go around. At times, fountains would run dry or water pressure would drop, leaving Parisians scrambling to find new sources. It was during this period of crisis that engineers began to rethink the entire water supply system. They needed to get creative fast. If Paris was to continue growing, the water supply couldn't be a stopgap solution. It had to be sustainable. Historians still argue whether the water supply crisis in Paris was inevitable, given the city's rapid population growth, or if it could have been avoided with better foresight. Some believe that Parisian officials should have anticipated the problem, while others argue that the rapid pace of urbanization simply caught the engineers off guard. Regardless of the cause, the solution would require an innovative, ambitious approach. The city had already begun tapping into new sources of water, like the springs outside the city. But the real breakthrough came when engineers began to develop a more sophisticated method of bringing water from these external sources into the heart of Paris. They realized that they didn't just need to expand the number of fountains, they needed to create a more reliable network that could manage the growing volume of water. It was at this point that the concept of a water distribution network began to take shape. Engineers began designing massive water pipelines, some of them up to several miles long, that would transport water from distant springs to the heart of Paris. These pipelines were carefully laid to ensure a steady flow of water, all while preventing the overflow that would flood the streets. But laying these pipelines was no easy feat. Paris was a maze of narrow streets, uneven ground, and other obstacles that would have sent most engineers packing. But the engineers, determined as ever, began the painstaking process of designing and building a network that would stretch across the city. And so, Paris's first true water distribution system began to take shape. By now, the engineers of Paris had taken a huge leap forward with their water supply system, but they were still far from solving the problem of controlling the water's flow into the fountains. The demand was unrelenting, and the city's population wasn't showing signs of slowing down. But at least there was progress. The aqueducts were starting to bring in water from distant springs, and the first large-scale pipelines were beginning to deliver the precious resource to the city. However, the real question was, how could they distribute the water to the fountains evenly, without risking flooding or shortages? This was where innovation truly kicked into high gear. Engineers realized they needed a way to manage and control the water flow effectively, so they began developing systems to measure and regulate the water. The key was not just getting water into the fountains, but ensuring it didn't overflow, flood the streets, or, just as importantly, run dry. Managing this delicate balance was an intricate process that required more than just pipes and aqueducts. It needed finely tuned control mechanisms. At the heart of these systems were valves and gates. The use of gates wasn't a new idea. it was borrowed from ancient water management systems, particularly those used by the Romans. However, Parisian engineers adapted these ideas to meet the unique demands of their city. They designed a series of gates and valves that could control the flow of water into the fountains, adjusting the pressure and ensuring that water was being distributed efficiently across the entire city. Historians still argue over the exact technical details of how these valves and gates worked, and some believe the system was far more complex than modern historians can fully reconstruct. Some suggest that the gates used mechanical systems to regulate water flow, while others argue that they used more rudimentary methods. Either way, the system worked, and it worked remarkably well, considering the complexity of the task. In addition to valves and gates, engineers also relied heavily on reservoirs to store and regulate the water supply. These reservoirs were placed strategically around the city, often at higher elevations, to create the necessary pressure for water to flow naturally to the fountains. The reservoirs worked in tandem with the aqueducts and pipelines, ensuring that the fountains always had a consistent water supply. But this system also had its own set of challenges. Reservoirs required constant maintenance, and engineers had to ensure that the water levels didn't drop too low, which could cause interruptions in service. The most brilliant part of this system, though, was the careful consideration given to the fountains themselves. Unlike simple spouts, the fountains were complex hydraulic machines in their own right. They were designed to regulate the water pressure, ensuring that the fountains didn't overflow or spill. The engineering behind these fountains was as sophisticated as the infrastructure that supplied them. A network of pipes, gates, and valves, all working together, made sure that the fountains kept flowing without flooding the city or running dry. While the systems were revolutionary for their time, they were still fragile. The fountains required constant attention, and the network of pipes and gates had to be monitored to prevent leaks, clogs, or any other failures. This required a small army of workers to maintain the water supply and ensure that everything was functioning smoothly. The work was not glamorous, but it was essential. The city had come a long way, but it was still facing many hurdles. The engineers and laborers of Paris had worked tirelessly to create an intricate, reliable water distribution system, but could they keep it going as the city grew? And would this new system be able to meet the demands of an even larger population in the years to come? Now that Paris had its water flowing with a remarkable level of control, the next challenge was scaling up, keeping all those fountains working and, more importantly, preventing disasters. Think about it. Imagine trying to manage hundreds of fountains, each one drawing from a network of aqueducts and pipes running all over the city. What could possibly go wrong? Well, a lot. For starters, the fountains weren't just pretty decorations. They were complex pieces of hydraulic engineering, each with its own set of intricately designed pipes, spouts, and mechanisms. These fountains, many of which were massive works of art, required constant maintenance to ensure the water didn't flow too strongly, causing it to overflow and flood the streets, or too weakly, rendering the fountains useless. Historians still debate just how hands-on the maintenance of these fountains was. Some believe that the upkeep of each fountain was largely the responsibility of local residents, who would have worked together to keep the water flowing smoothly. Others argue that a specialized group of city employees, including engineers and maintenance workers, was tasked with monitoring and fixing the fountains. What is clear, however, is that Parisian fountains were much more than just ornamental. They were critical to the daily life of the city, providing water not just for drinking but also for hygiene, cleaning, and even cooking. The fountains were also popular gathering places, where people came together to socialize, get water, and catch a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. The most famous fountains, like the grand fountains at the Place de la Concorde, became symbols of Paris's grandeur and sophistication. These fountains were carefully designed to make a statement, blending art, architecture, and engineering. But despite their elegance, they were still subject to the unpredictable forces of nature. If the water wasn't flowing properly, if there was a blockage, or if a pipe burst, the results could be disastrous. Keeping the fountains running smoothly required a constant balance of art and science. Engineers had to ensure that the fountains weren't just beautiful but functional. This meant carefully adjusting the pressure of the water and monitoring the flow to ensure that each fountain had just the right amount of water, neither too much nor too little. One key challenge was the seasonal nature of water supply. During the winter months, for instance, the water supply could freeze, damaging the pipes and making it harder to maintain a steady flow. During the hot summer months, the demand for water spiked, putting extra pressure on the already stretched system. And let's not forget about leaks. Inevitably, the pipes would spring leaks or get blocked, and someone had to fix them. Despite these challenges, the fountains continued to function as critical parts of the city's infrastructure. The fact that they could continue to work in such a sprawling, unpredictable city, while still managing to look beautiful, was a testament to the ingenuity of the engineers and laborers who built and maintained the system. And while these fountains were certainly impressive feats of engineering, they weren't just about the water. They were also cultural touchstones, symbols of the city's power, sophistication, and its ability to bring life to even the most mundane aspects of urban living. But what about the people who built and maintained these fountains? Who were the engineers, the laborers, the architects who made these monumental structures a reality? Let's take a look at the people behind the scenes, the workers who toiled to keep Paris's fountains flowing smoothly. As Paris's water systems became more complex, so did the role of the engineers, architects, and laborers tasked with making sure the fountains kept flowing without flooding the city. These were not just any workers, they were part of a highly specialized, albeit sometimes overlooked, class of individuals who worked tirelessly to keep Paris functioning as it grew. Their job wasn't just to build fountains and pipes, it was to ensure the city's intricate waterworks system didn't turn the city into a watery nightmare. One of the key figures in this process was the architect-engineer. These professionals were the masterminds behind the city's hydraulic designs, using their knowledge of mathematics, physics, and engineering to create systems that were functional, beautiful, and, most importantly, sustainable. These engineers had to plan for every possible eventuality, from dry spells to torrential rains. They had to figure out how to make sure that the water flowing into the fountains was consistent and reliable, without risking an overflow or shortage. Historians still argue about whether these engineers were given enough credit during their lifetimes. Some argue that these engineers were celebrated as the geniuses of their time, hailed as modern-day heroes for solving the complex problem of water management. Others contend that their efforts were largely ignored, with most of the credit going to the kings, architects, or the fountains themselves, rather than to the people who worked behind the scenes to make it all happen. Beyond the engineers, there were also skilled laborers and maintenance workers responsible for keeping everything running smoothly. These individuals would have been tasked with monitoring the water levels, fixing leaks, clearing blockages, and even making repairs to the fountains themselves. Imagine the scene: a skilled laborer, knee-deep in water, repairing a burst pipe, knowing that if they didn't fix it quickly, the whole fountain could run dry, or worse, flood the street. The work was tough, but without these unsung heroes, Paris's fountains would have never stood the test of time. And the scale of the work was massive. The city wasn't just relying on a handful of workers to maintain its fountains, they needed a whole network of individuals working together, each with a specific task. Some would be responsible for making sure the water reached the fountains in the first place, while others would maintain the fountains themselves, ensuring the water flowed smoothly without causing a mess. But there was more to it than just fixing pipes and valves. These workers were part of a larger, carefully orchestrated system that kept the city moving. They worked in the background, constantly monitoring and adjusting to make sure everything was functioning properly. Think of it as an early form of urban maintenance, an invisible backbone that kept Paris running. So, who were these laborers, and how did they come to be responsible for such crucial work? Many of them were trained in specialized workshops or apprenticed under more experienced engineers and architects. The process was grueling, often requiring years of practice before they could take on significant projects. The expertise needed to maintain Paris's fountains wasn't something you could just pick up overnight. It was a craft honed over years of careful study and hands-on work. These workers didn't just have to maintain the fountains, they had to deal with one more significant issue: the public's expectations. The fountains were not just functional pieces of infrastructure, they were public symbols. People relied on them, admired them, and often gathered around them. A malfunctioning fountain or a dry spout could lead to complaints, protests, or worse. These workers were, in essence, not just fixing the fountains, they were keeping Paris happy. Of course, there was also the financial side of things. The workers who maintained the fountains and the engineers who designed them had to be paid for their efforts. Paris's government, through various royal and municipal funds, had to find ways to finance these maintenance efforts. This wasn't a cheap system to run, and the cost of keeping the fountains flowing was a significant drain on the city's resources. But despite the challenges, these workers helped make Paris one of the most sophisticated cities in Europe when it came to water management. The fountains became an iconic feature of the city, drawing visitors from all over the world who marveled at the engineering feats that kept the city flowing, quite literally. So, next time you think about Paris's grand fountains, remember that they weren't just the work of kings or architects. They were the product of a community of engineers, laborers, and maintenance workers, all working together to ensure that the city stayed hydrated without flooding. By now, you've probably realized that Paris's fountains were far more than just beautiful displays of water. They were the backbone of the city's public water supply system. But here's where it gets really interesting. These fountains weren't just for aesthetic pleasure. They were also critical for public health. And, believe it or not, they were a huge part of maintaining hygiene in a city that was, at times, more crowded and unsanitary than you'd expect. At the time, Paris was not the sanitized, organized metropolis it is today. The streets were narrow and packed with people, animals, and waste. Disease was rampant, and there were few ways to fight it. Public fountains became essential for providing the masses with access to water for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Think about it. Where would you get water for washing your hands if there was no plumbing in your home? For most Parisians, the answer was a nearby fountain. The role of fountains in maintaining public health became especially important during the outbreaks of diseases like cholera and the plague, which often ravaged the city. Clean water, or at least access to water that wasn't contaminated with human waste, became a matter of life and death. The fountains, for all their architectural beauty, also doubled as public health tools, ensuring that at least some portion of the population had access to water that wasn't tainted by the filth of the streets or the river. Historians still debate how effective these fountains were in promoting hygiene. On the one hand, they were undeniably helpful, providing people with a reliable source of water for cleaning and drinking. But on the other hand, the fountains, like the city itself, were not free from contamination. Without modern filtration systems, even the water flowing from the fountains could sometimes carry bacteria and disease. But even with the imperfect quality of the water, these public fountains played a crucial role in maintaining a sense of cleanliness and order. They became hubs of social activity, where people would not only fill their jugs but also meet others, catch up on news, and take a moment to refresh. In an increasingly crowded city, the fountains became places of respite, offering both physical and social relief. At this point, the role of fountains wasn't just about functionality, it was also about creating a culture around water. People didn't just use fountains, they gathered around them. Socializing at a fountain was a regular part of life in Paris, much like visiting a park or public square today. And yet, despite their importance, the fountains weren't always universally accessible. Wealthy Parisians often had access to private water sources in their homes, including private wells and indoor plumbing, something the average person didn't have. This division of resources became even more apparent as the city grew. The fountains, while crucial to the public health of the city, were sometimes not enough to combat the underlying issues of sanitation and water quality. Still, for most people, they were a vital and reliable source of clean water, particularly in a time when having access to running water at all was a rare luxury. In a sense, the fountains represented a duality. On the one hand, they were marvels of engineering, symbols of the city's sophistication and beauty. On the other, they were essential tools for survival, key components of an urban infrastructure that helped keep disease at bay and provided a vital resource for everyday life. And that brings us to the financial aspect of it all. Maintaining and operating such a system didn't come cheap. Every fountain, every pipe, and every valve had to be paid for. The city's budget was stretched thin trying to maintain the complex network of fountains, aqueducts, and pipes. But the fountains were seen as an investment in the future of Paris. They were seen as symbols of the city's power, but also its commitment to the well-being of its citizens. As the population of Paris grew, so did the pressure to maintain this critical infrastructure. The fountains were more than just a decorative touch, they were a lifeline to the city's survival. And while the fountains may have started as symbols of royal grandeur, they became something much more. They were the city's lifeblood, necessary for keeping the population alive, healthy, and hydrated. As the 18th century progressed, the demand for water in Paris grew so rapidly that it outstripped the capacity of the existing system. More people, more needs, and more demand. The city's water infrastructure, though ingeniously designed, was starting to show signs of strain. And that's where the real challenge lay: how to ensure that the fountains continued to flow without causing a catastrophe. The stakes were high. If these fountains went dry or overflowed, it could lead to anything from public outrage to health crises. Managing the water distribution system in Paris required a level of precision and control that was only possible with the right technology, and Parisian engineers were nothing if not creative. They designed an intricate network of valves, gates, and control systems to regulate the flow of water into the fountains. But let's be clear, this wasn't just about turning a valve here or there. Engineers had to design systems that could adjust water pressure in real time, making sure the flow didn't become too strong, creating a flood, or too weak, leaving fountains dry. Historians still argue about how much of this innovation was the work of individual engineers and how much was the result of a citywide effort. Some believe that the success of the waterworks was a direct result of the genius of engineers like Jean de la Hire and others, while others credit the city's collective will to make things work despite the challenges. One thing is clear: the solution didn't come easy. One of the most brilliant aspects of the water distribution system was the development of pressure-regulated valves. These valves were critical in making sure the water reached each fountain at just the right pressure. If the pressure was too high, the fountains could overflow, flooding the streets and causing chaos. If it was too low, there wouldn't be enough water for the fountains to function properly. These valves acted like the city's lifeblood, allowing engineers to control the flow of water and keep everything in balance. But, as anyone who has ever dealt with a leaky faucet knows, valves and pipes were prone to failure. A broken valve or burst pipe could cause significant problems. And so, the engineers had to constantly monitor the system, ensuring everything was working as it should. This required not just technical skill, but a keen understanding of the city's needs and the challenges posed by nature. After all, the water they were working with wasn't always consistent. It depended on rainfall, river levels, and even the whims of the seasons. Beyond the technical aspects of the system, there was also the human element. Maintaining these complex waterworks required a dedicated workforce, from the engineers who designed the system to the laborers who kept everything running smoothly. These workers had to constantly check the valves, adjust the flow, and ensure that the fountains didn't run dry or overflow. In short, it was a team effort, one that required cooperation, persistence, and a lot of hard work. While the technology behind the water distribution system was certainly advanced for its time, it was the constant vigilance and the human dedication to maintaining the system that truly made it work. Engineers, laborers, and even the people who used the fountains every day were all part of a larger effort to keep Paris hydrated, clean, and functioning. But all this innovation wasn't without cost. The fountains and waterworks weren't cheap to build or maintain. The city had to pay for the labor, the materials, and the ongoing repairs. And as the population of Paris grew, so did the costs. The city had to continually invest in its water infrastructure to keep up with demand. But it was seen as a necessary investment, one that would ensure the health and well-being of its citizens for years to come. The water distribution system was, in a sense, a model for modern urban infrastructure. It showed that, with the right mix of technology, innovation, and dedication, a city could meet the needs of a growing population without drowning in its own success. But the system was still fragile. Paris's engineers knew that their work was never done, that maintaining the waterworks would require constant attention and innovation. The fountains may have been beautiful, but they were also a vital lifeline, and keeping them functioning was far from simple. As Paris's water system advanced, it became clear that it wasn't just a matter of building more fountains and digging more aqueducts. The entire system depended on constant upkeep. Just like today's complex infrastructures, the fountains, and the network that kept them running, required careful maintenance to function smoothly. A fountain might seem like a picturesque, flowing symbol of Parisian elegance, but behind the scenes, it was a demanding, high-maintenance machine. Maintenance was a never-ending task. The pipes, valves, and aqueducts were constantly in need of repairs. Leaks were a regular problem, especially with the older, underground sections of the water network. Over time, the pipes would corrode or become clogged with debris, meaning that water couldn't flow as efficiently. Engineers and maintenance workers had to frequently check the integrity of the pipes, ensuring that everything was working as it should. They also had to keep an eye out for any blockages that could disrupt the water flow. Imagine the scene: it's the middle of the night, and an engineer or laborer is climbing into the dark, damp underbelly of Paris, carrying their tools and lantern. They're heading to a section of aqueduct that's leaking, and they have to fix it before the morning, or risk an overflow of water flooding the streets. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was absolutely essential. The fountains couldn't function if the system was compromised, and the city needed the water, both for drinking and for public health. Historians still debate how effective the maintenance efforts truly were. Some argue that the system was relatively self-sustaining, with periodic checks and repairs being enough to keep the water flowing. Others suggest that the maintenance efforts were far more patchwork, with parts of the system frequently failing until engineers were able to fix them. Regardless of the specifics, the reality was that keeping the fountains running smoothly was a massive, ongoing task that required constant vigilance. Aside from the physical repairs, there were also the practical challenges of managing such a complex system. The fountains weren't simply places of beauty, they were critical parts of the public water supply. When something went wrong, the entire city could feel the impact. A problem at one fountain could affect several neighborhoods, causing water shortages and forcing people to go without. This meant that Paris had to have a robust system of repairs and contingency plans to handle the inevitable failures. The role of laborers in maintaining the fountains was particularly crucial. These workers weren't just fixing broken pipes, they were monitoring the flow of water, ensuring the fountains had enough to function, and dealing with any issues that arose. Without these laborers, Paris would have faced more frequent outages and water crises. And yet, these workers often went unnoticed by the general public. They weren't the ones designing the fountains or managing the city's waterworks, they were the ones making sure the fountains didn't run dry. Perhaps most fascinating of all was the fact that Paris had no real centralized system for tracking all the issues that might arise with the fountains. Workers and engineers had to be incredibly resourceful, using their knowledge of the water systems and their intuition to diagnose and fix problems. It was a highly decentralized system that relied heavily on the skills and expertise of the individual workers. Despite all the challenges, the maintenance system was, by and large, successful. The fountains continued to flow throughout the 18th century, providing the people of Paris with a constant, reliable source of water. And as the city expanded, more fountains were added to the network, further increasing the reach of the water supply. However, as with any complex system, there were still problems. The city's population continued to grow, and the demand for water grew right along with it. The existing fountains, while critical to the functioning of Paris, couldn't keep up with the increasing need for water. Eventually, the system would need to expand, and new methods of water distribution would have to be developed. As the century drew to a close, the engineers and workers of Paris faced a new set of challenges. The fountains that had once been the city's pride were now facing pressure from all sides. The city had outgrown its early waterworks system, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the next phase of water management would require even more innovation and ingenuity. As the 18th century wore on, it became evident that Paris's water supply was facing increasingly severe challenges. The city had grown rapidly, and its population was now larger than ever before. The fountains that had once been the pride of the city, symbols of grandeur and an essential part of daily life, were now barely enough to meet the demand. What had once been an elegant, efficient system was now struggling under the weight of rapid urbanization, overcrowding, and ever-increasing demands for water. One of the primary concerns was the issue of pollution. The Seine, Paris's main water source, had long been a receptacle for waste, and by the 18th century, its water was far from pristine. As the city's population expanded, so did the amount of waste dumped into the river. Raw sewage, industrial waste, and runoff from the growing number of homes and factories were contaminating the water, making it unsafe for drinking and posing a major public health risk. While the fountains were still in place, they were dependent on this increasingly contaminated water supply. Even with the filtering systems that were in place, the water was often far from clean, which led to frequent outbreaks of disease, including cholera and dysentery. Historians still argue over how much the contaminated water directly impacted the overall public health of Paris. Some suggest that it was the primary cause of the frequent epidemics that ravaged the city, while others believe that social and living conditions were just as significant. What's certain, though, is that the public fountains became a symbol of the city's infrastructure struggle, a struggle between grandeur and necessity, luxury and survival. In light of these challenges, the city began to look for solutions beyond just fixing leaks and cleaning fountains. The problem wasn't just the fountains, it was the water itself. What Paris needed wasn't just more fountains or better maintenance, it needed a complete overhaul of its water management systems. This would be no easy feat. The engineers had already accomplished so much, but the challenges were far from over. The key to solving these issues was developing new sources of water, and that's where things got interesting. Paris began looking at sources of water beyond the Seine. For the first time, the city explored options like wells and springs located further outside of Paris. These new sources could provide cleaner, more reliable water, reducing the strain on the already polluted river. But accessing these resources was no small task. The city needed to develop an entirely new infrastructure to bring this water into the heart of Paris, and that meant even more aqueducts, reservoirs, and underground pipes. At the same time, the city had to deal with the rapid growth of the population. With more people living in the city, the demand for water skyrocketed. The fountains, once thought of as an adequate solution, were now insufficient to meet the needs of Paris's growing populace. The city was running out of space for new fountains, and the existing infrastructure was too old to keep up. So, while the fountains themselves were still important, they no longer represented the city's primary water supply. Historians still debate how much of the problem could have been avoided. Some argue that better urban planning could have helped mitigate some of these issues, while others point out that the city's sheer population growth was unavoidable. What's clear, though, is that Paris was now facing an urgent need for a new system. The fountains had served the city well for over a century, but the time had come to evolve. For the first time, city planners and engineers started talking about centralized water systems, systems that would rely on underground pipes that could distribute water more efficiently. It was the beginning of the kind of water infrastructure we take for granted today, but in the 18th century, it was a revolutionary concept. These new systems would eventually replace the fountains as the primary way of delivering water to the people of Paris. But the transition wasn't easy. It would take years of work, investment, and planning to develop the infrastructure that could meet the growing demand. And while the fountains would continue to play an important role in the public life of Paris, it was clear that their days as the city's primary water source were numbered. As Paris entered the 19th century, the age of the fountain-based water system was coming to an end. But it had left an indelible mark on the city, a legacy of engineering brilliance, social importance, and the ongoing struggle to balance beauty with functionality. The fountains of Paris, in all their grandeur and complexity, had not only helped the city grow, they had shaped it in ways that would continue to resonate for generations to come. As the 19th century dawned, Paris was on the cusp of a water revolution. The fountains, which had once been the city's primary water source, were no longer able to meet the demands of an ever-growing population. The increasing population density, along with the rising health concerns due to contaminated water, highlighted the need for a new solution. The fountains were no longer just about providing water, they had become a symbol of the city's past, of a time when engineering was as much about art and luxury as it was about practicality. But now, with the streets of Paris teeming with people and disease threatening to spread, it was clear that a new era was approaching. By this time, engineers were already working on plans to bring water into the city more efficiently. The age of centralized water systems had arrived, and the fountains, while still valuable and iconic, were not the solution to the growing crisis. Paris was facing an infrastructure challenge of unprecedented scale. The waterworks system had to evolve to keep up with the rapidly growing population and the increasing industrialization of the city. But how could they do this? The answer lay in creating a reliable, citywide network that would draw water from cleaner, more distant sources, and deliver it straight to homes and businesses via underground pipes. The next step in this evolution was the construction of a series of reservoirs and pumping stations, designed to manage the water supply more effectively and allow the city to store large amounts of water in advance. These new systems were more sophisticated and robust than anything Paris had seen before. The engineers could now divert water from several clean sources, such as the River Ourcq and the River Van, to create a continuous flow that could be regulated more easily. In addition to reservoirs and pumping stations, Paris needed an entirely new piping system to distribute the water throughout the city. This new underground network, designed to handle far more water than the old system, was a feat of engineering in itself. The pipes had to be laid through the dense, narrow streets of Paris, and they had to be strong enough to handle the enormous pressure of the water flowing through them. But once complete, this system would revolutionize the city's water supply, making it more reliable, efficient, and, most importantly, safer. Historians still argue about the speed at which these changes occurred. Some suggest that the city was too slow in making the necessary upgrades, which led to ongoing issues with water access and quality throughout the early 19th century. Others believe that the process of modernizing the water system was an essential step in the city's evolution, and that the gradual implementation of these systems was what allowed Paris to expand so rapidly. Whatever the case, the impact of these new systems was undeniable. For the first time, Paris was able to provide clean, consistent water to its residents on a large scale, without relying on the old fountains. But the shift from fountains to pipes wasn't just a technical or engineering change, it was cultural, too. The fountains, which had once been symbols of civic pride and elegance, were now being overshadowed by the new underground water systems. The fountains would still be important public landmarks, and they would continue to play a role in the city's social life. But they were no longer the lifeblood of Parisian water supply. That role now belonged to the new network of pipes and reservoirs that stretched beneath the city's streets. The fountain's decline also marked a shift in the public's relationship with water. Instead of heading to a fountain in the square to fill their water jugs, Parisians now had water delivered directly to their homes. For some, this was a sign of progress, an indication that Paris was modernizing and improving its infrastructure. For others, it was a sign of loss. The fountains, with their ornate carvings and graceful waterspouts, had been central to Parisian life for centuries. They were the places where people gathered, where conversations were had, and where the city's beauty was on full display. Now, the fountains were simply relics of a bygone era. But even as the fountains became less important in the daily life of Paris, their influence remained. Many of the grand fountains of the city, particularly those at the Place de la Concorde and the Palais Royal, remained as monumental symbols of Paris's past. They continued to attract visitors from around the world, who marveled at the engineering and artistry that had gone into creating them. And, perhaps most importantly, they served as a reminder of the ingenuity and persistence of the people who had created them, even when faced with overwhelming challenges. Despite the advent of the modern water supply system, the fountains had left an indelible mark on Paris. They were not just about water, they were about the city's resilience, its creativity, and its ability to adapt to changing circumstances. And as the city moved forward into the 19th century and beyond, the fountains would always remain a part of its story. By the mid-19th century, Paris had undergone an unprecedented transformation. The city's water infrastructure, once a delicate network of aqueducts, fountains, and manual labor, had evolved into a modern system that could meet the demands of a rapidly growing population. But this transformation wasn't just about pipes and valves, it was part of a broader modernization effort that reshaped Paris, changing the very fabric of the city and its relationship with water forever. The construction of the new water distribution network, which involved bringing water from distant sources like the River Ourcq and the River Van, allowed Paris to provide its citizens with a reliable and clean water supply. No longer reliant on the dirty and unpredictable waters of the Seine, Parisians could now enjoy water that had been filtered, stored, and regulated to ensure its safety and quality. It was a monumental leap forward, but it wasn't just about making water available to the city's residents, it was about laying the groundwork for the modern urban planning we now take for granted. At the same time, Paris was undergoing massive changes in terms of urban design. The old, narrow streets of the medieval city were being replaced with wide boulevards, thanks in large part to the vision of Baron Haussmann, the chief architect behind the city's redesign. These new, grand boulevards were designed to improve the flow of traffic, promote public health, and create a more modern, cosmopolitan city. But they also required a complete overhaul of Paris's infrastructure, including its water system. The construction of underground pipes, reservoirs, and pumping stations didn't just serve the purpose of bringing water to the fountains, it was part of a larger effort to ensure that the new, modernized city had the infrastructure to support its growing population. Paris was no longer just a medieval city, it was becoming an industrial powerhouse, and it needed a water supply that could keep up with its rapid growth. Historians still argue about how much the modernization of Paris, and particularly its water systems, influenced the city's transformation into a global metropolis. Some believe that the improvements in public health, sanitation, and water access were key to the city's rise as a cultural and economic center. Others argue that the broader changes in urban design and architecture were the true driving force behind Paris's modernization. Either way, one thing is clear. The evolution of Paris's water system played a crucial role in making the city what it is today. As the 19th century progressed, the role of fountains in Parisian life continued to shift. While they were no longer the city's primary source of water, they remained important cultural landmarks, symbols of the city's grand history and its engineering prowess. The fountains still attracted visitors and provided a public space for people to gather, but they were no longer as central to the daily life of Parisians. The underground water system had taken over, quietly delivering clean water to homes and businesses, transforming Paris into one of the first modern cities with an efficient and reliable water supply. And yet, the legacy of those early fountains, and the engineers, architects, and laborers who built them, remains a part of Paris to this day. The fountains were not just about water, they were about Paris's spirit, its ingenuity, and its drive to solve problems through innovation. The story of how Paris managed its public fountains without flooding everything is not just a tale of engineering triumph, it's a story of a city's resilience, its capacity for adaptation, and its relentless pursuit of progress. But even as the fountains faded into the background, their influence could still be felt. They served as a reminder of what was possible when a city came together to solve its most pressing challenges. The fountains were, in a way, the heart of Paris, pumping life-giving water to its people, while symbolizing the beauty and potential of the city itself. As we look at Paris today, we can still see echoes of the fountains that once defined the city's water supply. The grand fountains at the Place de la Concorde, the Palais Royal, and countless other locations remain iconic symbols of Paris's history. But they are also part of a larger narrative, one that tells the story of a city that learned to adapt, to innovate, and to use its resources to build something lasting and meaningful. The story of Paris's fountains is not just about water, it's about the triumph of human ingenuity over the challenges of nature. And in that sense, the fountains will always be a symbol of the city's resilience, creativity, and determination to stay afloat, no matter how difficult the journey. As we wrap up this journey through the evolution of Paris's water systems, it's important to pause and reflect on how far the city has come. The fountains, once the centerpiece of Paris's water infrastructure, have seen their role dramatically change over time. From essential public utilities to historical landmarks, the fountains are more than just architectural wonders. They are symbols of a city that adapted and innovated to overcome challenges that seemed insurmountable at the time. In many ways, the story of Paris's fountains is a microcosm of the city's larger history, a city that has faced countless obstacles, from overcrowding to disease outbreaks, yet has always found a way to push forward. The fountains of the 18th century were the first steps in an ongoing story of progress and change. The city's engineers, laborers, and planners were pioneers in water management, creating systems that would lay the groundwork for modern urban infrastructure. Their work not only shaped the city but also influenced the development of water management in cities around the world. And while the fountains may no longer serve as the primary source of water, they still hold a special place in the hearts of Parisians and visitors alike. They represent a time when the city's engineering prowess was at the forefront of global innovation, and when public works were not only about function, but also about art and beauty. Today, the fountains continue to serve as meeting points, places of respite, and symbols of the city's rich cultural heritage. Looking at the modern-day Paris, it's easy to forget how much of the city's infrastructure was built on the backs of these early innovations. The water systems, which were once pieced together with ingenuity and perseverance, now operate with a level of efficiency that would have seemed unimaginable to the engineers of the past. Yet, in a way, we owe much of that efficiency to the foundations they laid. The fountains, with their elegant carvings and graceful waterspouts, may seem like mere relics of a bygone era, but they are far more than that. They are a testament to the spirit of Paris, its commitment to innovation, its ability to adapt to changing times, and its unyielding desire to provide for its people. They may no longer be the city's primary water source, but they are still an integral part of the Parisian landscape, and they remind us of a time when every drop of water mattered. Now, as we drift off to sleep, think of those fountains flowing gently through the streets of Paris. The engineers working tirelessly behind the scenes, ensuring that the city's lifeblood was flowing freely and safely. The workers who spent their days fixing leaks, checking pipes, and making sure that everything was running smoothly. And of course, the Parisians, gathering at the fountains, sipping water, sharing stories, and enjoying a sense of community in a city that was always on the move. The story of Paris's water management, like the city itself, is one of constant transformation. From the challenges of the 18th century to the modern day, Paris has always found a way to adapt and thrive. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson we can take from it, that no matter how complicated or difficult things may seem, there is always a way forward, a way to keep the water flowing and the city alive. So, as you settle into a peaceful sleep tonight, let the gentle sound of water flowing through Paris's fountains lull you into rest. Let the quiet hum of the city's past remind you that every problem can be solved, and that even the most daunting challenges can be overcome with a little ingenuity, persistence, and teamwork. Sweet dreams.